there probably isn't a sustained increase in demand for toilet paper. You're probably not going to use more toilet paper, right? So people are just stocking up because you're still going to use the same number of rolls. You're not going to generate more feces, right? Okay, so for this episode, let's talk about the economics of COVID-19. So specifically, let's talk about some of the interesting dynamics that are happening in the grocery store, right? So we look at hand sanitizer, masks, toilet paper, they're all sold out. There are price controls being put in place, and then there's also limited quantities being put in place as well. And then there's also things like dairy farmers dumping their milk. So I thought for us to talk through it, let's take an economics lens to it and try to understand what are some of the underlying dynamics that are happening that are driving some of these behaviors from the consumer perspective, and some of the responses from the grocery stores and from the government as well.
Mm-hmm. So before we go there, can you explain to us what is economy and what is economics?
Yeah, sure. So I think most people think that economics is just, the study of money or the study of finances, and it's really about quantitative factors. But that's not really the case. The economy is really the behavior of people to trade things that have different values for each person, right? So let's say, if I'm holding a bottle of water, and the closest 7-Eleven is 2 kilometers away, right? You just finished running in a marathon. Well, I paid $2 for that bottle of water, and you might be willing to pay $5 for it because you're really desperate for it. You don't want to walk another 2 kilometers for it. Well, we just created $3 in value when we exchange. When I give you that bottle of water and you give me the $5 bill, we just created $3 in value because you value that water $5 and you're giving me $5, right?
To put it simply, to me, economics is the study of that, and which is basically studying people's choices and the trade-offs that are involved, right? So, and probably that's why economists cannot really predict the future, because a lot of this is based on behavior, and behaviors are influenced by a variety of factors, right?
That's exactly right. And I think that's, so if we think about what economists do is they try to build models. So they try to build approximations of how people are going to behave. And one of the most basic models that in economics is the supply and demand curve, right? So if we think about what is the supply and demand curve? Well, as the name suggests, there's two curves. There's a supply curve and there's a demand curve. So the demand curve is downward sloping, meaning as the price goes lower, as you go down that y-axis, there's a higher quantity demanded. You're going to increase in that x-axis. On the other hand, supply is upward sloping, meaning as the price goes higher, there's going to be a higher quantity that's supplied. And this makes sense intuitively, right? So if the price of a certain good goes lower, you'll think that more people have access to it, more people will buy it. If the price of a good goes higher, more companies will want to start selling it, right? And vice versa. The point where these two curves meet, that's where the equilibrium price is, right? So that's where the kind of optimal price is, where the quantity demanded is the same as the quantity supplied. And that's where you see most of the prices of goods end up being.
So these changes, these movements works for me when things move across this curve, right? But there are also other externalities that might change these models. Can you talk a little bit more about those factors that might change the supply and demand curves and how it specifically applies to a situation with COVID?
Yeah, so sure. Let's explore a little bit about this. So we talked about kind of the price changes and how that changed the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. But the entire curve, the entire demand curve or the entire supply curve can move itself, creating new equilibrium prices. So some of the factors behind why the demand curve will shift are things like, just changing preferences. I suddenly want to buy more Doritos or more Cheetos, more snacks, right? And so if I want to buy more snacks, then the snack demand curve is going to shift to the right. And when we see what we see there in effect is people are going to end up buying more, and it's going to be at a higher price. Whereas if I, on the other hand, if I wanted to eat less snacks, right? If the whole country wanted to eat less snacks, the demand curve is going to shift to the left. And we're going to see that there's less quantity demanded. So people will buy less and they will pay a lower price to buy it, right? So that's what happens when the demand curve is shifting. On the other side, on the supply side, what's really driving it is mostly the cost of producing these goods. So if I'm paying more for labor, if I'm paying more for shipping to get it into a retail store, that's going to increase the price of production. And what that's going to do is it's going to shift the supply curve to the left. So when we see the shift of the supply curve to the left, what we see is there's lower quantity that's being produced, right? And that's being consumed, and you see a higher price being paid for it. And then on the other hand, if it's cheaper for me to produce a good, that supply curve is going to shift to the right. And what that means, you'll see that the equilibrium price goes down. That means it's going to be cheaper for people to buy, and people are going to buy more of it. So that intuitively makes sense, right? The cheaper it is to produce something, the cheaper the that I'm going to sell it, and the more that people are going to buy it, right?
Yeah. Would it also make sense when there are more sellers or there is consolidation happening in the market? Would it shift these curves or the supply curves left or right?
So that's really interesting. When there's a consolidation in suppliers, what you're doing is you're eliminating that competition. And so they're able to set the price at whatever level they want to set. And you can actually see the impact of it. So if you set the price higher than the equilibrium, you're actually going to sell less of it, but you're going to capture more what we call of the consumer surplus. Whereas if there's a lot of competition, then you're getting closer to the equilibrium price. That's how the competition works and the market power works.
That's great, Eugene. So why don't we use economics to go deeper into some of the things that is happening at the grocery store? Maybe why don't we start with what is really going on with the whole hand sanitizer mask thing? Can we find out some insights from an economic standpoint?
Yeah, for sure. So from a standpoint of masks and hand sanitizers, let's think about it from a point of view of our behaviors, right? As individuals, even as a culture. So what we're seeing right now, if you go outside and you go to a grocery store, you're starting to see people wearing masks. And you're starting to see hand sanitizing stations everywhere. What you're likely to see is that behavior is going to be adopted and it's going to be sustained over time. So maybe it's not to the same level as it is today, but maybe people will start wearing more masks in the future when they get sick, right? So we can look towards the Asian countries here for examples. If you look at Korea, China, Hong Kong, Japan, after SARS, they all adopted a culture of wearing more masks. And so what that means is you're likely going to see a real sustained increase in the demand, which if we go back to our supply and demand curve, that demand curve is going to shift to the right. And that means you're going to see a price increase and you're going to see the amount purchased increased as well.
So that makes sense. If prices are going to increase and that's going to drive more suppliers to produce more sanitizers and face masks, then why are we having price controls on it? And what is it doing to this current situation?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So what a price control does in the short term, what does it do? So let's again put that price at the same level as it was before COVID, and let's keep that price at that level. And now let's move the demand curve to the right. What we're seeing there is a gap between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. So that means there's a shortage. That difference is a shortage of supply to demand, and so you have to do something about it, right? If you want to keep the price the same and the access the same to everyone, what you're going to do is you have to increase the supply, right? So you're going to have to shift the supply curve to the right in order to meet the demand curve at the same price point. And as we talked about before, that means we have to reduce the cost of producing that particular good. And what the government response is that they have committed to buying these goods at an increased price. They've committed to subsidizing the production of these goods so that companies can now set up factories to produce masks, to produce sanitizer at a lower price point, so you'll see a higher quantity that is produced, and it'll keep that price the same while meeting the quantity demanded.
Price ceilings create shortages, and the way governments intervene is by subsidizing the cost of production, so suppliers can sell it at a lower price.
That's right. And then so that you meet at the same price point, you can meet that increased demand.
So how is this situation different from the rational mad rush towards toilet papers? Because we're not going to be using more toilet papers, right? There's only so much you can use over so much period of time. So what's going on there?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, and here we actually see a different response from the grocery stores and from the government than for masks and hand sanitizers, right? So the response is from the government is that they're not going to subsidize the production of toilet paper, and why it is because there probably isn't a sustained increase in demand for toilet paper. You're probably not going to use more toilet paper, right? So people are just stocking up, right? And for the next however many months that they want to stock up for. But you're still going to use the same number of rolls. You're still going to use the same number. In fact, you might even use less now that you're probably rationing because you're afraid of shortages. But let's take that complexity away. You're probably going to use the same amount of toilet paper. You're not going to generate more feces, right? So what's happening there is that it's not a real sustained increase in the demand curve. The demand curve is not shifting right. You're not going to use more toilet paper in the long run. It's just a particular behavior right now that people are stockpiling. So you have to control that stockpiling, panic buying behavior. And so the responses to that is to make sure that you limit the amount of product that people can buy so that they're not able to stockpile and create these temporary shortages. And you're also going to criminalize, right, the ability for people to temporarily buy up all the stock and then price gouge others by selling it on third-party websites like eBay, Kijiji, right? So once you have those controls in place, in the next 1 to 2, maybe even 3 months, if it stretches out that much, the demand is actually, because people will see that the grocery stores are able to put the stock back on the shelves and that the supply is able to meet the demand and there's no longer any panic in the system, the prices will remain the same, and you can start to phase out those controls that were mitigating the panic buying and the temporary shortages. So in the long run, you will see no changes to the supply curve and the demand curve. You'll see no changes to prices, and those controls can start to be taken away.
So we also hear in the news about dairy farmers dumping milk because the demand has pretty much gone down. Like all the coffee chains, Starbucks, Second Cup, Tim Hortons are all closed, so they're dumping their produce. Is there some economics behind that? Why that is happening? Can we also rationalize it with economics?
Yeah, so that's a really good example because that is one example where there isn't a completely free market in play. There's actually regulations and controls in the supply chain. There's a price floor for dairy. So when there's a price floor, again, to your point, the the quantity demanded has gone down, right? If I'm no longer going to Starbucks every day and buying my latte, so I'm drinking less milk, and that's a real change over the next few months. That's going to be sustained for a period of time, right? And the uniqueness of milk and dairy products is that they spoil, they go bad. So there's a certain lifetime to the product, right? And you can't kind of store it indefinitely. So as my quantity demanded goes down, it shifts to the left. You can see what happens if we keep the price at the same level. The quantity supplied at that price is greater than the quantity demanded at that price. So now you have an excess of supply. When we're thinking about a product that goes bad, that spoils, you can't just store it indefinitely. What you're going to have to do is you're just going to have to get rid of it, because it costs money to store, and if if the price is going to go lower, or if the price is not going to change, then it makes no sense for you to spend the money to store it in the first place. The cows are going to keep producing the milk, and then B, it just like you just can't store that product indefinitely, right? So that's why it leads to the behavior of dairy farmers actually having to dispose of the milk.
Yeah. So is it fair to say, or in the next, at least in the next 1 to 2 months, because of supply issues, mainly due to labor and logistics, and maybe it may not be the demand has changed, but because of supply issues and the supply curve moving towards the left, is there any reason to think that there might be some kind of inflation on essential goods?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if we think about the model, you think about let's say food, right? Probably more expensive to produce food right now or in the next few months. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, right? You can't bring in temporary foreign workers. Your borders are closed. So you have to hire Canadians. Canadians are typically command a higher wage, or in the US, Americans typically command a higher wage. So you're going to have to pay more for labor. So that's going to, again, to your point, shift that supply curve to the left. And you're going to see that people are going to actually buy less food because they can now not afford as much food because the price is going to go up, right? So what can offset this again is if we think about government taking steps towards mitigating that by subsidizing the production of food, right? So if they subsidize the production of food or other essential goods, again, that shifts the supply curve back to the right, and it could it could create the same dynamic as it currently is, and keep the same equilibrium price.
Makes sense. So why don't we take this a step further and then look at things at a very macro level? And the reason why I want to talk about it, the last 2 months, the economy is probably in a standstill, right? We are producing very little economic activity. So even if we assume that in these 2 months, the economy is operating at only 50% capacity, that is still 1 month of lost productivity. So that means 1/12 of GDP is gone, which is like 8 to 9%. To put it into more perspective, the Bank of Canada was estimating for the economy to grow around 1 to 1.5%. Now we are saying there's going to be a drop in 8 to 9% if the economy shut down at least till the end of May. And if it goes longer, it's even more. And global economy by itself, it's estimated to be going down by at least 30%. Let's briefly talk about what are the impacts to the economy, especially when governments are thinking that they have to restart the economy to get us all going, right? So what are we thinking about here?
So let's go back to the model, right? Let's go back to our original conception of what the economy is. Economics is really just a description of all of the behaviors that you and I undertake in order to create value, right? The impacts to the economy then is when you say that GDP is dropping, it means that we're interacting less, right? We're just engaging in fewer of those behaviors so that there's a decline in the number of those interactions, and there's a decline in the value of those interactions. That's what it really means when we say that GDP is shrinking. So what that translates to in terms of jobs, it means fewer people are employed. Right? If fewer people are employed, there's less of those behaviors. And so when we think about restarting the economy, there's going to be a huge cost right up front to look for those people again, to hire them again, and to train them, and to find that right match of skill set versus need. And companies will need to start to take on debt or somehow finance their ability to get the workers that they need to continue their business operations. And so what happens there is, as companies start to take on more and more debt in order to restart their operations, and now you've got that dynamic of people starting to work together again and in close spaces again. Again, you might have that second wave of COVID-19 that comes along, right? And which causes another shock to the economy. It makes us have to shut down the economy again. And now what happens is companies have increased their debt load, right? And their revenue has dropped again, and so their ability to pay off this debt is going to be severely compromised, and they're going to be in a much worse off condition than they would have been if you don't start the economy too quickly, right? Yeah,
great point. So just to put this in perspective, so if in the U.S. right now, there are only two companies that are AAA rated, Microsoft and Johnson & Johnson.
Right.
Almost 40 to 50% of the companies are all BBB or under. So BBB is just above junk status, right? So that means that's the level of the corporate debt that's out there. Now adding, like you said, adding more debt on it, like would push them to insolvency. They won't be able to pay off their creditors, right? Correct. And that mass bankruptcy can be really, really dangerous.
Yes. Yeah. So let's think about that, right? Like basically what the ratings stand for is my confidence, or the rating agency's confidence, that you're actually going to get the cash flow that's required to pay off the debt that you've incurred, right? And so once we can think of this like an analogy of running a run on the bank, right? So the people buying the debt, right? The people who are the lenders, they're going to say, hey, I want my money back because the economy is not doing so well. My investments are falling. So I really need you to pay this back, right? The companies, to your point, are only going to be able to pay back so much of their debt, right? They're going to go bankrupt. And so when that happens, it's like dominoes falling, right? I can't get the entire amount that I lended to you, Cheyenne, back. So I need to get some money from this other company, and they can't pay me the full amount. So now I need to ask this other company to pay me, and they can't pay me the full amount. So I'm going to ask all the companies that I've lended to pay me back, and I'm going to get only a fraction of it back, and all of these companies are now going to go bankrupt, right? So it's one domino falling and leading to that domino effect of a lot of companies starting to default, and that's going to be a major impact to the economy if that happens.
This COVID has changed the world like in so many different ways, right? Can we also talk about like post-COVID? What other changes can we expect to see from an economic standpoint, from manufacturing standpoint? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so something that's probably interesting is we're probably not going to see a complete reversion to the way that we were in the past, at least in the urban setting, right? In rural settings, you might have similar interactions, but in the urban setting, we're going to be a little bit more conscious of being socially or physically distanced from each other. As this situation draws out, companies will need to start to innovate in order to lower their operating costs, right? So if we need to socially distance, that means there's going to be an increase in real estate demand. If I'm going into the office, I don't know how far you're sitting away from your coworker right now, but my coworkers may be like 3 or 4 feet away. And if we physically need to distance, they need to be 2 or 3 more feet away from me, right? So each individual is going to take up more space. It's going to be like let's call it 30 to 50% more real estate for each individual, and then you multiply that price out to your whole company, and all of a sudden you've got huge increases in your operating cost. So what that's going to do is it's going to put pressure on you to find savings elsewhere.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. So when we think about things like automation, there's huge complexity to automation. And what companies have found in the last couple of years is that there wasn't much of a push towards automating because it costs a lot to make it happen. And you're getting a return that you're not going to see for a very long time, right? You're not going to break even on that investment for a really long time. What COVID is doing is it actually creates that burning platform, right?
Yep.
Now you actually have to reduce your costs in order to stay alive as a company, as a business.
Yep.
If you don't do it, you will not survive because you cannot actually handle the increased costs to your business operations. So that's something that I think we need to take a look on, and really the whole economy possibly shifting away from more physical interactions to more digital interactions. So even more, for example, we might not go out for dinner as much. There's an app called Netflix Party, right? We might just jump on that app, have webcams talking to each other and watching the Netflix together while we eat dinner, right? Yeah. That might be part of the new normal. These are some of the things that might change in the future. And again, if we think about the economy as our behaviors, right? Our behaviors are the economy, right? They make up the economy. So that's going to look really drastically different as well.
Digital transformation, automation used to be a luxury, and it's no more, right? We may ask the question, like, how does manufacturing going to work? How does industries going to operate, right? Maybe for manufacturing, we invest in robotics, right? And we have people who sit at home that are monitoring and servicing these robots or managing these robots. So maybe that's how the economy will grow or adopt, right?
Yeah,
so
that's right.
there's a lot of interesting things that can happen post-COVID.
Yeah, and that speaks to kind of, whenever there's a fundamental shift in the way that we deliver value, right? Think about when electricity was introduced. So you went from having steam engines in factories. So you have to attach, each machine to a particular the power source, which is like a crankshaft that actually powers that machine. Now you can plug it anywhere in the factory. And so you have it completely changes the way that you lay out the factory. It completely changes the skill sets that you have because you're now going from a machine that's mechanically operated to one that's electrically operated. And it's going to completely change the jobs that people do. It will require a large part of the population to reskill and get re-educated to what the new jobs are going to be.
Yeah, just like the steam engine, just like the internet, just like IoT. Yeah, this will be a massive, massive change, potentially a fifth industrial revolution.
Yeah, and then you couple that with 5G. It's going to be some major changes to the way that we interact with each other.
Yeah, I guess that's a silver lining. Okay.